There's a thing that happens in the desert when you've been out there long enough. The land stops feeling empty and starts feeling like it's watching you. Not in the way superstitious men talk about, not spirits, not omens. Something quieter than that. Something with weight. I've ridden through the Sonoran Basin more times than I can name. I've seen a calf die slow in August heat and not flinched. I've watched a man I rode beside for 3 years get thrown from his horse and break his neck on a dry creek bed, and I went back to work the next morning because that's what the land asks of you. You don't stop. You keep moving. The desert doesn't wait for grief. But I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened with Emmett Rourke and that pup. I need you to understand that I am not a sentimental man. I keep a logbook. I've kept one since I was 19, not a diary, nothing soft like that. Distances, weather, stock counts. The kind of data a man needs when memory gets unreliable and the days start bleeding into each other. My father thought it was strange. My trail boss thought it was stranger. But when you're responsible for moving 500 head of cattle across terrain that can kill them 6 different ways before noon, you learn to write things down. So when I tell you I wrote Emmett Rourke's name in that logbook, wrote it on a day when I had no professional reason to, you should understand what that means. It means something shifted. It means the land wasn't just watching anymore. It means I was. The day I first saw Emmett Rourke clearly, not just as a silhouette on the ridge, not just as the rancher who'd bought the Caldera parcel 2 seasons back, was the day I found the pup. I want to be precise about the timeline because the logbook matters here, and the logbook says it was the 14th of April, a Tuesday, temperature already at 91 by 9 in the morning. We were running a water line check along the southeastern fence of the Vargas grazing corridor, me and my outrider Delia Suarez, when Delia's horse shied sideways and she nearly came off the saddle. "Something in the wash," she said. I rode forward. The arroyo was bone dry, hadn't seen rain in 11 days, and the bottom was cracked pale like old porcelain. In the shadow of the far bank, wedged into the angle where rock met sand, was a dog. Or what used to be a dog. It was unclear. Small, brown-gray, ribs like fingers pressed through wet paper. It wasn't moving, but its side was heaving, that fractured, irregular heave of something breathing, because it hasn't figured out how to stop yet. "Leave it," Delia said, not cruelly, matter of fact. "It's done." She was right, probably. That's the honest thing to say. A pup that far gone, that far from any water source, in April heat on its way to June heat. The math wasn't generous. I know that math. I've applied it to cattle, to horses, to men. You calculate what's recoverable and you don't waste resources on what isn't. I dismounted. Delia made a sound, not a word, just a sound. I climbed down into the arroyo bed, which took more effort than it sounds because the bank was steep, and I'm not as young as I used to be, and I crouched next to the pup. Up close it was worse. One ear was torn, old wound, dried dark at the edges. The paws were cracked. The eyes were open but not tracking, that particular unfocused quality that means the body is conserving everything for the single mechanical act of respiration. I put 2 fingers against its throat, faint pulse, there. I pulled my canteen, poured a small amount into my cupped palm, and held it near the pup's muzzle. Nothing for a moment, then the tongue moved, slow, automatic. That's when I heard boots on the bank above me. I've been looking for that dog. I looked up. Emmett Rourke was standing at the edge of the arroyo, hat in hand, squinting down at me. He was older than I'd expected, mid-50s maybe, with the kind of face the desert carves over decades. Lean jaw, deep-set eyes. A white scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline, which I would learn about much later and from him in pieces, never all at once. "Yours," I said. "No." He came down the bank faster than I had managed, with the ease of a man who's been dropping into arroyos all his life. He landed in the sand next to me and looked at the pup, and something changed in his face that I can only describe as a door opening in a room you didn't know existed. "Found her 3 weeks ago, couple miles north. She was in bad shape then. Fed her, gave her water. She'd come around most evenings." He paused, thought she'd moved on. "She nearly did," I said. He nodded. He had the habit of nodding slightly longer than necessary, 3 or 4 beats past the moment of acknowledgement, like the thought was still arriving somewhere deep, and he was confirming it. I'd noticed that habit again and again over the following months, catalogued it in the logbook without knowing why. "I can take her," he said. "You have the Caldera place." "That's right." The Caldera parcel was 6 miles from the nearest reliable water, which either meant Emmett Rourke hadn't thought through the logistics, or he'd thought through them completely and decided they weren't the point. I handed the pup up. He held it against his chest with the particular care of someone who has held fragile things before, not tentative, not stiff, but measured. One hand under the hindquarters, one along the back, the pup's head resting in the angle of his arm. He stood there a moment, still doing that slow nod. "She'll probably die anyway," I said. I wasn't trying to be cruel. It was the truth, and I thought he should have it. "Yeah," he said, "probably." He climbed back up the bank. My logbook entry for April 14th reads, at the end of the routine notations, "Met Rourke. He took the pup. Seems foolish or deliberately contrary. Possibly both." I don't know why I wrote that last part. I usually don't editorialize. The next time I saw Emmett was 3 weeks later, at the Yucca Flat Co-op meeting where ranchers in the corridor discussed water rights and grazing rotation. He sat in the back row, which surprised me. Most newcomers to that room worked hard to establish themselves, to be seen, to signal they belonged. Rourke just sat. He had a coffee he didn't drink. He listened to 2 hours of dispute over a water easement, with the attentive stillness of a man who has learned that most arguments resolve themselves if you wait long enough. Afterward, in the gravel lot, I asked about the pup. He looked at me for a moment like he was deciding something. "She's alive," he said. "Good." More than that, he reached into his shirt pocket and produced his phone, a battered thing with a cracked screen, and showed me a photograph. The pup standing in a doorway, still thin but standing, ears up, eyes clear. "Oh," I said. "Yeah," he put the phone away. "There's something about her I can't figure." I waited. He had that quality of pausing before the actual sentence, like he was editing in real time. "The way she looks at things," he said. "She doesn't look at things like a regular dog." "She's been through something," I said. "No," he shook his head once, and there was a certainty in it that seemed disproportionate to the evidence. "It's not trauma. I know what trauma looks like in an animal. It's something else." He got in his truck and drove north on the county road. I stood in the gravel and watched him go, and then wrote down that evening, "The pup is alive." Rourke thinks it's unusual. He may be projecting. Possible loneliness. Note that he came to co-op meeting alone, left alone, did not seek conversation except when addressed. I paused after writing that, looked at it. Added, he could be right about the dog. "I want to tell you something about the Sonoran Basin in spring before it tips into summer, because it matters for what comes next. The desert in April is not what most people imagine when they think of desert. It's not barren, it's not simple. The saguaro are flowering, white blooms at the tips of the arms, opening at night, visited by bats you can hear but rarely see. The ocotillo are red at the tips, an almost arterial red that seems wrong in that landscape, too vivid, like a wound that won't close. The soil is alive in ways that don't announce themselves, mycorrhizal networks under the crust, seed banks waiting for rain that may or may not come, the entire slow, patient machinery of survival. You have to look carefully to see any of it. That's the thing about the desert. It doesn't offer itself. You have to pay attention or you'll ride through it your whole life and see nothing but distance. I had been paying attention to it for 23 years. I thought I knew what I was looking at. The first time I went to the Caldera property was in May, 6 weeks after the arroyo. I had professional reasons. The southeastern fence of the property abutted our grazing corridor, and there was a question about a water catchment that needed physical inspection. Delia offered to go. I said I'd handle it. She gave me that look she has. She's been my outrider for 8 years, and she has maybe 4 distinct expressions, and one of them is "you're doing something you don't understand yet," and that was the one she aimed at me. "I'll handle it," I said again. The Caldera place was more than I expected. The house was small, a converted ranch structure, old adobe, thick walls that held the cool, but the land around it had been worked. Not in the way a man works land to produce something. In the way a man works land to understand something. There were irrigation channels that followed the existing drainage patterns rather than fighting them. There was a small shade structure built over what I recognized as a catchment basin, positioned to collect runoff from the roof and the surrounding caliche. There were native plants established in patterns that suggested deliberate spacing: brittlebush, paulo verde, wolfberry. Whoever had designed this, it wasn't done in one season. It had the look of years of slow correction. Rourke met me at the fence line. He was in work clothes, not the performed work clothes of a man who wants to appear capable, but the genuinely filthy garments of someone who had been on their knees in the dirt since first light. His hands were raw. There was a scrape along his jaw that he didn't seem to notice. We walked the catchment line. He knew what he was talking about, not just the engineering of it, but the hydrology, the soil composition, the way water moved through the specific geology of this part of the basin. I had to revise several of my earlier assumptions about him. "Where'd you learn this?" I asked. "Slow way," he said, which I understood to mean, by being wrong many times in sequence. Halfway through the inspection, the pup appeared. She came from behind the house, trotting with the careful energy of an animal still rebuilding its reserves. But she wasn't tentative. She moved with a kind of deliberate intention that you don't usually see in dogs that age. And I could see now that she was young, maybe 7 or 8 months, still growing into legs that seemed slightly too long. She stopped at a distance and looked at me. I've been around working dogs my whole life. I know the difference between a dog that's observing you and a dog that's assessing you. This was assessment. Specific, focused, with that strange quality that Rourke had tried to describe in the parking lot, the sense that the looking was going somewhere. "She's a Mexican gray wolf pup," I said. The words left my mouth before I'd fully formed the thought, which is not something I do. I'm careful with language. I use it accurately or I don't use it. But I said it, and once I said it, the evidence assembled instantly. The long legs, the large paws, the shape of the muzzle, the coloration, the eyes, the way she held her weight. Rourke looked at me. His face had gone very still. "Yeah," he said, "I know. There's a weight to that word when it holds more meaning than it lets on." I stood there in the May sun and processed the fact that Emmett Rourke had known for some period of time that he was harboring an endangered Mexican gray wolf on a private cattle ranch in the Sonoran Basin, and that he had continued to do so anyway, and that he was currently watching me with the expression of a man who has decided to let someone else see a thing he has been carrying alone. "How long?" I asked. "Since about the 3rd week. When she started growing out." He pulled off his hat. There was the scar again at his temple, white and quiet. The ear shape, the movement, paw size, I looked it up. "You understand what that means, legally?" "Yes. They're still listed. Endangered and protected, you can't." "I know." I looked at the wolf pup. She had sat down and was watching us discuss her with that focused, eerie calm. Her eyes were amber at the center, going darker at the rim. Large, unblinking. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Rourke put his hat back on, did his slow nod. "I was hoping you'd have a thought on that," he said. I wrote 4 lines in my logbook that evening and then crossed 3 of them out. What remained was, Rourke is keeping a libido. He's not stupid about it. I don't know what happens next. Libido is what the Sonoran ranching families call them. Little wolf, the smaller cousin of the northern gray, bred into scarcity over a century of systematic killing. There are fewer than 200 left in the wild. Some people in this valley have fought their entire adult lives to bring that number up. Some have fought equally hard in the opposite direction. I knew where I was supposed to stand on the question. I had spent 23 years in this valley maintaining relationships with ranchers on both sides of that fight, because my job required it, because the cattle business requires alliances that your personal opinions can't always dictate. I had cattle on ranges that abutted known wolf territory. I had watched the calculus of loss and coexistence play out in real time. A calf gone here, a compensation dispute there, the long grinding argument about what the land is for and who it belongs to. I had opinions. I had kept them to myself. Emmett Rourke was asking me to stop keeping them to myself. Not directly. He would never be that direct. But he had shown me the wolf pup and then looked at me in the way that people look at you when they are not sure they're going to survive something and they want to know if you're in. I didn't sleep well. I wrote things in the logbook and crossed them out. I looked at the ceiling of my bunkroom for a long time. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed about the arroyo. About the pup in the shadow of the bank, her side heaving with that broken, stubborn breath. 6 days later, I drove back to the caldera. Rourke was at the water channels adjusting a diversion gate. He heard the truck and straightened, waited. I got out and walked to him. The wolf pup, she had grown noticeably in 6 days, which was both a marvel and a problem, came around from the shade structure and stopped 20 feet from me. She was learning to calibrate. How close was safe? What information did proximity give her that distance didn't? "I know a wildlife biologist," I said. "She's with the recovery program. She's also a person who understands that most situations don't fit into their official categories." Rourke nodded 3 beats, 4. "She'll want to assess the pup," I said. "See if she's viable for reintroduction. See if there's a pack she might belong to. There are things that can be done quietly before anything becomes official." "And if she's not viable," he asked, "for reintroduction?" I looked at the wolf pup. She looked back at me. "Then we figure out what comes after that," I said. It was the most I'd committed to anything in a long time. I noticed that on the drive home. I also noticed that I hadn't written it in the logbook first, hadn't calculated the angles. I had just said it. The desert, it turns out, has a way of burning through the habits you've built to protect yourself. The end of part 1 finds Emmett Rourke standing in the late afternoon light with a wolf pup at his feet, and a rancher he barely knows, having just agreed to something neither of them fully understands. The light at that hour in the basin turns everything amber: the soil, the saguaro, the air itself. It's the hour when the heat relents just enough to remember that it's not permanent, that something else always follows. I looked at the wolf pup one more time before I got in the truck. Her eyes were amber too. I don't know what that means exactly, I just wrote it down. Her name, not the official one that would come later, the one in the recovery program database, was something Rourke never actually said aloud in my presence. He didn't call her anything at first. He'd gesture in her direction, or say she or her, and I noticed he was careful never to name her the way you name a pet. He was calibrating distance the same way she was, both of them trying to figure out how close was safe. I noticed him noticing himself doing it once. We were sitting on the porch of the adobe in the early morning, June by then, the heat already pressing down like a hand on the back of your neck, and the wolf came around the corner and he started to call her and then stopped. His mouth opened, formed the beginning of a sound, and then he pulled it back. "You're afraid of naming her," I said. "I'm afraid of a lot of things," he said. "That particular one, I'm handling the sensible way." It was the most he'd said at one time in my presence, and he seemed slightly surprised by it himself. He picked up his coffee mug and looked into it for a moment. "She's not mine," he said. "I need to remember that." Dr. Mira Calles arrived on the first Thursday of June in a gray government truck she'd borrowed from a friend in the Fish and Wildlife Regional Office, because her own truck would have been recognized in the valley. She was somewhere around 40, with the compact, efficient movements of a person who spends most of their time in terrain that punishes inattention. And she had the ability, which I've noticed in very few people, of making herself seem less significant than she was until the moment you needed her to be otherwise. She assessed the wolf pup for 3 hours. Rourke and I waited on the porch. He was doing the thing with the coffee again, making it, not drinking it. I was writing in the logbook. Things I could see from where I sat. The ocotillo hedge along the south fence had grown 6 inches since April. The catchment basin held water even though there hadn't been rain in 9 days. There were 2 ravens watching from the top of the tallest saguaro, which is not unusual, but they'd been there for an hour, which is. Mira came back to the porch and sat down and did not speak for a moment. "She's female," she said, "approximately 8 to 9 months. Weight is still below optimal, but she's coming up fast. The ear, the torn one, she was likely in a fight, not with another wolf. Bite pattern is wrong." She paused. "She has the right behavioral markers: wariness, spatial assessment, that particular quality of stillness." "Is she viable?" Rourke asked. Mira looked at him for a moment in a way that suggested she was reading not just the question, but what was behind it. "For reintroduction, potentially, but she's been socialized. Not domesticated, she hasn't crossed that line, and I think that's partly because," she glanced at Rourke, "because you've been careful not to cross it with her. She's still functionally wild, but she's lost some of the full wariness she'd need." "So reintroduction is harder," I said. "It means preparation, managed exposure reduction, a transition protocol before any introduction to a pack. It's not impossible." Mira picked up her water bottle and took a long drink. "But there's something else." She looked at her notes, looked up. "The genetic profile, I took a swab, I'll have to run it, but based on physical markers alone. She doesn't match the recovery population profiles I know. She's not from the managed gene pool. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, the efficient quality was still there, but something else had come in underneath it. If she's wild-born from a breeding pair that isn't in our records, she represents a genetic line we don't have. The ravens shifted on their saguaro. That's significant, I said, because the silence was large and something needed to go in it. Yeah, Mira said, that's a polite word for it. I wrote that night for a long time. The logbook entry is longer than any other. I had to continue it on the facing page, which I had never done before. I was trying to understand what had happened in April in that arroyo and what it was connected to, the way you track water back through channels to find the source. A wolf pup, female, wild-born, carrier of a genetic line not in the official recovery database, had ended up alone in a dry creek bed in April, dying. She had been found by a cattle rancher who had no professional obligation to retrieve her. He had kept her alive through weeks of careful feeding and watering. He had recognized what she was and not reported it, not out of malice toward the species, but out of some instinct, I believe this now, that the wrong kind of official attention would not serve her. He had been right. Mira confirmed that later. If the pup had been formally reported in the state she was in, the protocol would have been immediate pickup, quarantine, and processing through a system that was already overwhelmed and underfunded. Her specific genetic significance would likely not have been identified until she was already folded into the managed population in ways that might have diluted what made her unusual. Rourke's decision to wait, which looked from the outside like law-breaking driven by sentiment, had actually preserved something specific and valuable. He hadn't known that when he made the decision. He'd just made it. I wrote that down and stared at it. There's something uncomfortable about a man making the right call for the wrong reasons, or no reasons at all, just instinct, just the unwillingness to walk away from something still breathing. It doesn't fit into a moral framework cleanly. It resists the narrative that good outcomes require good understanding. And yet, Mira came back 2 weeks later with the genetic results. She'd driven from Tucson. She'd come alone, which was unusual for her. She had a lab partner she usually brought to field assessments. She sat at Rourke's kitchen table and spread 2 pages of analysis on the wood and let us read them before she said anything. I'm not a geneticist. I read what I could parse. I looked at Mira. She has a haplogroup variant that we've only seen in historical specimens, Mira said. Specimens from before the 1970s population collapse. It means she descends from a breeding line that everyone, and I mean everyone in this field, assumed was extinct. The kitchen was quiet. How is that possible? I asked. We don't know. We're speculating a remnant population in deep mountain terrain that never got fully cataloged. There are canyons in the Sierra Madre that nobody has done systematic surveys of. Something survived. This pup is evidence of that. She gathered the pages. Which means she's not just significant for the recovery program. She's potentially significant for understanding what the original Sonoran population actually looked like genetically before we started managing it. Rourke was sitting at the end of the table looking at the middle distance. He had the expression he sometimes wore when his thoughts were running faster than he was letting on, a particular stillness of the face that was actually the opposite of stillness underneath. What happens now? He asked. That's what I wanted to talk to you both about, Mira said. What happened now was complicated in the way that things involving science and law and human territorial instinct are always complicated. The formal path, report the find, transfer the pup to the recovery program, flag the genetic analysis, allow the official machinery to handle reintroduction. Clean, legal, Mira would be protected. Rourke would face some kind of reckoning for the months of unauthorized possession, but Mira believed it could be handled diplomatically given the outcome. The informal path, a longer transition period at the caldera, the pup continuing her semi-wild acclimation under Mira's unofficial guidance, with eventual integration into a pack via a protocol Mira had used in one previous case, quieter, less documented, more effective from a behavioral standpoint. The second option has risks, Mira said. For me, professionally, for Emmett, legally, the extended unauthorized possession is the problem. And the first option, I asked. Lower personal risk, less optimal outcome for the wolf. she said it flatly, without performance. She'd survived the formal route, probably, but her behavioral window, the fact that she's not fully domesticated, the fact that she still has viable wild instincts, that window closes faster in captivity. Every month she spends in a facility instead of terrain, something dims. Rourke stood up, walked to the kitchen door, and stood there looking out at the yard. The pup was visible at the edge of the shade structure, which is where she spent the hottest part of the afternoon. "It's your risk," I said to him. "More than mine or Mira's, you need to make the call." He was quiet for a while. "She was dying in that arroyo," he said. "Everything that makes her what she is, the genetics, the instincts, whatever she is, that was dying. I didn't know what she was. I just knew she was dying." He turned. "I'm not comfortable with the idea that the right answer in this situation is the one that serves the institution better than it serves her." It was the longest thing I'd ever heard him say. He seemed slightly embarrassed by it. Mira nodded. "Then we do this carefully," she said, "and we do it together." June became July. The wolf pup grew. I was out there twice a week, sometimes 3 times, nominally because of the water catchment consultation, but actually because I had developed an investment in the situation that I hadn't consented to and couldn't now withdraw. I logged the pup's behavior with the same careful attention I gave to everything else in the logbook: distance maintained from humans at various times of day, food behavior, territorial marking patterns, responses to sound. She was becoming herself. That's the only way I can put it. In April, she'd been a question, the biological possibility of a wolf. By July, she was the answer to that question. She moved with authority through the 20 acres around the caldera that she'd established as her range. She hunted jackrabbits, desert cottontails, the occasional ground squirrel, with the methodical, patient geometry of a predator who has internalized the landscape completely. She still tracked human presence, still calibrated distance, but she did it now from a position of confidence rather than fear. Rourke watched her and said almost nothing. I asked him once in July whether he talked to her. "When it's just us," he said, "not commands, just talking." "What do you talk about?" He was quiet for a moment. "Mostly what I'm doing, what the water channels need, what the weather looks like." He paused. "What I was doing before this. Before the caldera. Before here," he said, which I understood to encompass more than just the property. I didn't ask more than that. I wrote in the logbook, he's healing something. She is too. The mechanics are different, but the direction is the same. The trouble arrived in late July. It didn't announce itself. Trouble rarely does out here. It accumulates, a rumor, then a report, then a face at a fence line you recognize as belonging to a specific set of opinions. The face was Cade Villanuva's. He ran 700 head of Angus on the range directly south of the caldera, and he was the kind of man who had formed his views about wolves at a specific point in his life and welded them shut. His family had lost calves to predation in the 90s, in the early days of the Arizona reintroduction program, and that experience had become the whole of his understanding. I don't say this dismissively. The losses were real. The grief was real. But the calculus had stopped updating somewhere around 1997 and had been running on that fixed data ever since. He stopped me at the co-op in late July, said he'd been noticing unusual tracks on his south grazing section, said he'd heard things at night, said he knew what wolves sounded like and he'd been hearing wolves. "You're sure?" I said. "I know what wolves sound like," he said again. He had a rifle in the back of his truck. He almost always had a rifle in the back of his truck, which was legal, which was not the problem. The problem was the way he was talking about the tracks and sounds, with the particular focus of a man who has found a target and is working out the approach. I drove to the caldera directly after. Rourke listened to what I said. His face did the thing it did when his thoughts were moving faster than his expression that contained stillness. "She's been ranging further south at night," he said. "I've been monitoring the tracks. She crosses the fence line sometimes." "Villanuva's land." "Yes. She hasn't. No livestock interaction that I've seen, but she's exploring the territory. The wolf was doing what wolves do. She was mapping her world, extending the known edges, finding the boundaries of what was safe. She had no mechanism for understanding that the boundary between the caldera and the Villanuva range was also a boundary between tolerance and hostility. Mira needs to know, I said. I called her this morning, Rourke said. She's coming Saturday. Saturday might be too late if Villanova. I know. He looked out toward the shade structure where the wolf was resting, invisible in the midday shadow. I know. There's a decision I need to tell you about that happened in the days between that conversation and Mira's arrival. And I want to be careful about how I tell it because it's easy to simplify it into something it wasn't. Rourke drove to Villanova's ranch, alone, without telling me first. I found out from Delia, who had heard it from Villanova's wife at the feed store, and I drove to the caldera that evening in a state that I can only describe as controlled alarm. Rourke was at the water channels, running the evening inspection. What did you do? I asked. Talked to him. About the ranch, the water situation. His south grazing section has a drainage problem I've been watching. He's losing topsoil faster than he knows. I told him about the catchment system, offered to walk it with him. I stood there. You went to Villanova's and talked about water management. He's a rancher, Rourke said. That's what ranchers talk about. You didn't mention. No. I processed this. You went to build a relationship. I went to be a neighbor. He looked at me. You can't change a man's opinions by arguing with them. You can sometimes change what he does by making him see you as a person first. It was calculated. I want to be clear about that. It was a calculated move, not a sentimental one. Rourke had assessed the situation and identified the only lever that had a reasonable probability of working. It wasn't warmth. It was strategy deployed in the shape of warmth. But here's the thing I kept returning to in the logbook. The calculation wasn't separate from the feeling. He genuinely had noticed Villanova's drainage problem. He genuinely had useful knowledge to share. The strategy and the person were not in different compartments. I've been thinking about that ever since. Mira arrived Saturday morning with 2 colleagues she introduced only by first name, and whose presence she didn't explain beyond they know what they're doing. They walked the range for most of the day. They set up camera traps at the fence line and in the areas of highest wolf activity. They took soil samples from the areas where Mira suspected denning behavior. Late in the afternoon, Mira pulled me aside while Rourke was inside making food for everyone. She's going to den, Mira said. I looked at her. We don't have a male in the area, she said, but she's showing preparatory behavior. It might be a false den. Wolves do that, exploratory. But it might not be. She's barely a year old. Wolves can breed at 2 years, but preparatory behavior starts earlier. Mira's voice was careful. If she's denning, if she's found or is finding a mate. There'd have to be another wolf in the area, I said. A wild-born one. Yes. We looked at each other. If there's a pair, Mira said, if there's a breeding pair with her genetics and an unknown male, this isn't just a significant find. This is, she stopped. This changes the nature of what we're doing here. The ravens were back on the saguaro, 2 of them. I looked at the saguaro for a while. Write it down, I said. Excuse me. Whatever this is, write it down carefully with dates. I'm not sure why I said that, but I said it. Whatever happens next, someone needs to know the beginning of it. Mira looked at me like she was seeing something she hadn't expected. Yeah, she said, okay. That evening, the 4 of us sat on Rourke's porch and ate the food he'd made, beans, rice, green salsa from the garden he'd established along the north wall. And the conversation moved around the situation without ever landing on it directly. The way conversations do when everyone at the table is holding the same large and frightening hope, and nobody wants to say it first. The sun went down. The bats came out for the saguaro flowers. The wolf came in from the south at full dark, visible only as movement at the edge of the porch light. She stopped at her habitual distance, settled onto her haunches, and looked at the 4 humans on the porch with that amber, assessing gaze. Nobody spoke. She looked for a long time. Then she stood, turned, and went back into the dark. One of Mira's colleagues, the younger one, a woman who'd been quiet most of the day, said, so quietly it was almost to herself, I've never seen one that close. Rourke picked up his coffee, looked into it. She decides, he said. How close, always her decision. It was the simplest thing he'd said about her, and it was the truest. August in the Sonoran Basin. does something to the quality of the air that's difficult to explain to people who haven't been inside it. The monsoon rains arrive or they don't, and the threat of them hangs over everything, and the light changes. It becomes heavier. The sky is more present, more involved, a low, deep blue that presses down on the land and makes everything feel compressed and significant. I've been out here through 23 Augusts, and I still have to consciously resist the feeling that the weather is trying to tell me something. It's not a rational feeling. I write it in the logbook anyway. August was when things moved faster. It started with the camera traps. Mira's colleagues retrieved the cards on a Thursday and sent her the files by encrypted transfer. They were being careful. They'd been careful from the start. And Mira called me on a Friday afternoon, which was unusual because she almost never called. She usually texted in compressed shorthand that matched the way I kept notes. She called. "Second Wolf," she said. I sat down. I was in my bunk room and there was nowhere to sit except the bed, and I sat on the bed. "Male?" I asked. "Male, adult, maybe 3-4 years, large, significantly larger than what we see in the managed population. And Rafe." That was her colleague's name, the older one. "Rafe says the gait analysis looks like Sierra Madre origin, same mountain population as her." "They found each other," I said. "Found each other," she said, and in her voice was the controlled, professional distance of a scientist who is also a person watching something they've spent years working toward happen in front of them. "He came to her, or they came to the same place. I don't know which yet." I looked at the wall of my bunk room. "Does Rourke know?" "You're the first call," she said. "Can you be there tonight?" We sat in Rourke's kitchen with Mira's laptop open on the table and watched the camera trap footage. The male wolf was enormous. That was the first thing. He made the landscape around him look smaller, not because he was out of scale, but because his presence organized the space differently. He moved the way certain people move, who have survived enough that survival has become structural rather than effortful. In one clip, the female appeared at the edge of the frame. They didn't approach each other immediately. They moved in parallel for a while, maintaining distance, doing the calibration that both of them seemed to have inherited or learned or both. The male kept his attention on the perimeter, watching the fence line, reading the air, while the female moved closer, then back, then closer again. In the final clip on the card, they were 6 feet apart, both still, looking at each other. Rourke watched the screen and didn't move for a long time after the footage ended. "What does this mean for her?" he asked Mira. "For her specifically. For what happens to her. Whether she stays here or goes or—" "It changes everything," Mira said. "And I need you to understand that in both directions. If they're pair bonding, if they establish territory, if there's a litter, this is a wild breeding event with genetically significant animals in an unmanaged space. That's extraordinary. It's also a situation that will eventually have to become official." "How eventually?" I asked. "Longer than I would normally accept," she said, "because what we have here is a natural process that is going to get better data than anything we could engineer. Every week of observation before this becomes official is a week of baseline data on natural behavior that we don't have in the managed population." She closed the laptop. "But Emmett—" "I know," he said. "I can delay the official notification. I can make a professional case for the observation period, but there will be a notification. And when there is, this property becomes the center of something very large." He nodded 3 beats, 4. "And Villanova," I said. The word landed in the room with the specific weight of a problem nobody had solved. "What happened with Villanova?" Mira asked. Rourke told her. The water management conversation, the offer to walk the drainage with him. He'd done it. They'd walked the south section together in late July. Villanova had listened. Hadn't committed to anything, hadn't changed any obvious positions, but had listened. Mira was quiet for a moment. "That may not be enough," she said. "No," Rourke agreed. "But it's the right kind of not enough." He meant this, that the relationship was real, even if it hadn't yet bent the outcome anywhere useful. That you could not shortcut a man's willingness to reconsider something by presenting him with facts. Facts didn't do that. Facts were neutral until there was a relationship around them that made them matter. Rourke had been building the relationship not as a trick, but because he understood that the relationship was the actual work. "I've been running cattle through this valley for 23 years. and I've watched people fight about land and water and rights, and what belongs to whom, and I have never in my observation seen an argument won by being right. I have seen positions shift slowly under the pressure of proximity and shared experience, and the gradual accumulation of moments in which the other person is recognizably human. Rourke was accumulating those moments with Villanueva, slowly, without guarantee. The rain came in the second week of August, which was early by recent standards. Real rain, not a dusting, not the performance of rain that drops 0.2 of an inch and evaporates before it reaches the soil. 0.75 of an inch in 36 hours, which moved water through the basin in visible ways, filled the catchment systems, softened the crust of the caliche, turned the dry arroyos briefly into things that moved. I was at the caldera when it started. I helped Rourke manage the overflow from the catchment. He'd engineered it for exactly this scenario, the valves and channels designed to redirect excess flow into subsurface storage rather than let it run off the property. It was elegant. It worked. We were both soaked before noon and neither of us mentioned it. The wolves, both of them now, were visible during the rain in a way they usually weren't. The male moved along the eastern edge of the property, tracking the water movement. The female was on the ridge above the adobe, watching the arroyo where I'd first found her fill with brown water, and I could see her from the window of the house while Rourke and I ate lunch, and there was something in the way she stood there, the posture of a creature watching a place it has claimed, that was difficult to look at for too long. "She knows this arroyo," I said. Rourke looked where I was looking. "She was born somewhere in this system," he said. "The water knows her probably, the way the water knows everywhere it's been." It was the kind of thing he said occasionally that I couldn't fully parse but couldn't dismiss either. I wrote it down. The knock on the door of the caldera came on a Saturday, which was the kind of timing that makes a person believe in either fate or Murphy's Law. We had not been warned. Mira was in Tucson. Her colleagues were on separate field assignments. It was just Rourke and me and the rain-softened afternoon and the sound of boots on the porch, and then Cade Villanueva standing in the doorway looking at us. He had not come alone. He had his son with him, younger, early 20s, the kind of young man who doesn't yet know what face to make in situations that haven't resolved. The son was carrying his hat in his hands and turning it slowly, which I recognized as a nervous gesture, and which told me at least something about why they were here. "Emmett," Villanueva said. "I saw the tracks." Rourke stepped back from the door. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. The son continued to turn his hat. Villanueva looked at the table and then at Rourke and then at me, and I saw him make the calculation of whether I was a complication or a neutral party and settle on neutral enough. "2 wolves," he said. "My south section, 3 nights running." Rourke poured 2 more coffees, set them on the table. "I know," he said. Villanueva looked up. "They're ranging on your land at night," Rourke said. "The female has been using the area south of your drainage cut. The male follows the same corridor." "You've been watching them?" "Yes." The kitchen was very quiet. The son had stopped turning his hat. "How long?" Villanueva said, not a question. The flat delivery of a man who is managing something underneath his voice. "The female since April," Rourke said. "The male appeared in late July." Villanueva put both hands flat on the table. He was a large man, wide shoulders, thick forearms, the hands of someone who has been physical his whole life. The gesture was not aggressive. It was the gesture of someone anchoring themselves. "My father lost 3 calves in '94, he said. "Gray wolves, the reintroduction." "I know," Rourke said. "You told me." "I swore I'd never," he stopped. "My father swore." "That was your father," Rourke said, carefully, without judgment. The son looked up. Villanueva's jaw worked. He was doing something internally that I could see the outside of, but not the inside. He was running a calculation that involved his father and his own history, and the fact that he was sitting at a man's table drinking a man's coffee, and that man had just been honest with him when he could have lied, and the coffee was still warm, and the rain was still coming down outside. "Have they touched any livestock?" he asked. "No," Rourke said. "You'd know." "I'd know Mira," he paused. "The biologist I've been working with, she has cameras on the corridor. There's no livestock interaction." "But there could be," Villanueva said. "There could be," Rourke agreed. "That's an honest answer." Another long silence. You should have told me, Villanueva said. Yes, Rourke said, I should have. The son put his hat on the table and left it there. Villanueva looked at the table, looked at Rourke, and then he did something that I don't think he planned. I've replayed it many times in the logbook, tried to account for it. He just said, "What are you going to do with them?" Not what should be done. Not they need to be removed or this is illegal or any of the things he had the legal and cultural standing to say. He said, "What are you going to do with them?" And in the phrasing of it was an implicit acknowledgement that this was Rourke's situation, that Rourke was managing something, and that Villanueva was, at least in this moment, at least in this kitchen, curious about what it was. Rourke told him, not everything, but the shape of it, the genetics, the significance, the fragility of the window, the possibility of a breeding pair with a genetic line no one knew existed. He spoke without drama. He spoke the way he spoke about his catchment system, with the technical clarity of someone who has spent time understanding something and wants to transmit the understanding accurately. Villanueva listened. He drank his coffee. His son listened without turning his hat. When Rourke finished, Villanueva was quiet for a while. "I need to think," he said. "That's fair," Rourke said. They left. The son shook Rourke's hand at the door, which surprised me and may have surprised Rourke. Villanueva nodded once, not Rourke's multi-beat nod, a different kind, the nod of a man who is leaving a conversation that is not yet over. I stayed another hour after they left. Rourke didn't talk and I didn't push him to. The rain had lightened to something between mist and drizzle, the air full of petrichor and the smell of wet creosote, which is one of the specific smells of the desert after water, sharp, resinous, alive. The female wolf had moved off the ridge. The male was visible at the eastern fence, which he used sometimes as a route marker moving south. "He might still make the call," I said, finally. "Villanueva." "He might. Fish and wildlife, or someone worse." "Yes." I watched the male wolf move along the fence until he was out of sight. "How are you sitting with that?" Rourke was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought he might not answer. "I've been thinking about April," he said. "About finding her in the arroyo. I think about it more than makes sense, given everything else that's happened since." "What about it?" "I didn't know what she was," he said. "I still don't fully. None of us do. That's the honest truth. We've done the tests, we have the data, and we're still standing at the edge of something we don't fully understand." He looked south, the direction the male had gone. "But when I got down into that arroyo, I wasn't thinking about what she was. I was just thinking that she was still breathing and that I had water." He was quiet again. "I can't control what Villanueva does," he said. "I can't control what the notification process brings. I can't protect her from every possible bad outcome. I've spent a lot of time trying to think my way around that, and I've gotten exactly nowhere." He picked up his coffee and then set it down without drinking it. "All I had was a canteen, all I ever had." Mira filed the preliminary notification in the 3rd week of August. She had built a professional case for the observation period that was 3 years of expertise compressed into 12 pages, and she filed it with the regional office of the biologist she trusted most, and she called me the afternoon it went through. "It's official," she said, "which means it will take a few weeks before anyone acts on it. The regional office is 3 staff down and behind on 3 other cases. We have time. And Villanueva." I spoke with him. Her voice was careful. "He called me. He found my contact through Emmett." I sat with that for a moment. "He asked questions," she said. "Good questions. About livestock depredation rates in voluntary coexistence zones versus mandatory, about compensation programs, about what the actual record shows versus what the received story shows." A pause. "He's going to come to the property next week, to see the camera footage." I didn't say anything. "Emmett invited him," Mira said. "I know," I said, which wasn't true, I hadn't known, but which felt true because of course Rourke had. Of course he had. The logbook from that period is fuller than any period before it. I kept writing things down that felt important to preserve, that felt like evidence of something I didn't fully understand but didn't want to lose. I wrote down the morning in late August when I arrived at the caldera early, before Rourke was up, and sat on the porch with a coffee and watched the wolves at the edge of the eastern wash in the gray pre-dawn light. They were 50 feet from me. The male faced east, reading the wind. The female faced south, toward Villanueva's land. They stood like that for 20 minutes without moving, like markers in a landscape, like something the desert had placed there deliberately. The light came up slow. The saguaro bloomed at the tips in the dark, the white night flowers, the ones the bats visited, and were closing now as the day arrived. The female turned once and looked directly at me with those amber eyes, the full weight of her attention, and then turned away. I wrote that down. I don't know what she is. Rourke was right about that from the beginning. None of the categories fit. She is what she is, which is the only thing any living creature is, and most of the time we call it by the wrong name. I crossed that out, then I wrote it again. Villanueva came on a Thursday. He watched the camera footage in silence. Mira narrated the behavioral data, the ranging patterns, the territorial markers, the evidence of pair-bonding behavior, the absence of any livestock interaction across 11 weeks of documentation. Villanueva watched without speaking. His son came with him again. The son was the one who asked most of the questions, and the questions were technical and specific, and indicated that he had done some reading in the days between visits. Rourke answered him directly, with the same careful precision he applied to everything. At the end, Villanueva stepped out of the house alone. I followed him, not because I was invited, but because someone needed to. He stood in the yard and looked toward the south, toward his own land visible beyond the fence. My father would have made a different decision, he said. I know, I said. I'm not saying that to justify anything. I'm saying it because I've been thinking about it, about how much of what I think is mine and how much is his. He was quiet for a while. I don't have an answer to that. You don't need to have an answer, I said. You just need to decide what you're going to do. He looked at the fence. I'm not going to make any calls, he said. Not yet, maybe not at all. He said it the way people say things when they're surprising themselves. I want to see what happens, I want to see, he stopped. I want to see if what he's saying is true, about coexistence, about whether it actually works. It's not guaranteed, I said. No, he looked at me. Nothing out here is. The last entry in my logbook from that period, from the specific summer that this story is about, though I know the story continues, is from a morning in late August, written at the caldera before anyone else was up. The wolves were not visible that morning. The male had been ranging further east, which Mira said was territory mapping, normal behavior for an establishing pair. The female had spent the previous night near the arroyo, the same arroyo, the dry one, though it had water in it now from the August rains, shallow and amber over the pale, cracked bed. I wrote what Rourke did in April was not heroic. I want to be precise about this. He found an animal near death and gave it water. He didn't know what it was. He didn't calculate the outcome. He didn't understand the significance. He just responded to a living thing with what he had. And then he kept responding. That's the part I couldn't see from the arroyo. The April decision was easy compared to everything that came after. The decision to keep her while he figured out what she was. The decision not to call it in when the legal risk was clear. The decision to go to Villanueva's door. The decision to tell Villanueva the truth when the easier path was available. Each of those was made with less information than would have been comfortable under conditions that were not designed for good decisions. He made them anyway. That's the part I don't know how to account for in the logbook. That's the part that doesn't fit into the columns. I stopped writing, looked out at the yard. The female came around the corner of the adobe from the north, where the wolfberry bushes were, moving with that deliberate calm, and she stopped at the water bowl that Rourke had stopped filling weeks ago. She was hunting on her own now, didn't need it, and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at me. I didn't move. She stood there for a long time, longer than the assessment usually took. I had the feeling that the assessment was finished and that something else was happening in the space after it, something I didn't have the right category for. Then she moved south through the yard, past the shade structure, toward the fence and the arroyo and whatever was beyond it. I looked at the logbook. The page was mostly full. I had room for 2 or 3 more lines.